Okay, hello everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I think I speak for all of the student panelists and also the school when I say that I'm really excited for us to have our guest today, Dr. Berti, who's coming from Brussels, conveniently also to her hometown of Bologna, where she's from. But yeah, I think we're all looking forward to hear what she has to say. I think this will be, if it goes well, a fairly unstructured conversation. So we'll kind of ask questions, talk to her, and if during this you have some questions, feel free to raise your hand. I would like to avoid waiting for the last 30 minutes to have questions, because sometimes 20 minutes go by and you feel guilty about turning the conversation back to previous topics. So because I'm sort of hosting this, I'm going to see how that goes. Maybe a huge mistake, or it could be interesting. Anyway, that's enough preamble. I'm just going to do a couple of brief introductions. We have Alex, who is in the MAGR program. That's one of our one-year programs, as you know. He has some NATO experience. Also, Priya, who put this, made this all possible. So we're very grateful to her for that. She's actually worked for Dr. Berti before in NATO on the policy planning side. And also we have Natalie, who kind of brings together the transatlantic piece of this with her own experience at the Department of Defense in the United States, where she was also in policy planning and implementation. And then there's me, who I'm Sean, and I just like to be included in stuff. So people have graciously included me. I guess it feels right to maybe start with a little round of applause just to thank Dr. Berti for coming. Yeah, it was all me for sure. No, so anyway, like I said, I'm just happy to be here, like the rest of you. So I guess let's get started. First, I guess, Dr. Berti, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself a little bit. I know that your career has taken you all over the world. You've lived in places as remote and underdeveloped as Boston, Massachusetts, and but also, sorry, I'll try to refrain from disparaging comments.
Please don't.
Yeah, okay, I really won't then. But no, we're here to talk about transatlantic security, but you also have really a great body of research and some deep experience in Middle East and North Africa and human rights. So I guess, can you maybe tell us a little bit about how your career made that transition from one side of Europe to the other, and also maybe some current pressing issues that you're dealing with at NATO?
Sure. Well, thank you for the introduction and the kickoff question. And it's really nice to be in my hometown. I haven't lived here for most of my life, but that's where I was born. And this is the first time I actually talk about anything work related in Bologna. So that's a first for me. What do I do? And then I'll get into the more what NATO is doing, which may be while you're here. In terms of what I do now, I lead policy planning in the office of the Secretary General of NATO. So that's a cabinet function. It's about providing strategic advice and planning to the Secretary General when it comes to pretty much everything that has to do with the alliance, political and military adaptation, as well as how it's preparing for a changing strategic environment. So it's a fairly broad portfolio, as Priya can attest from our time there. It's from strategic competition and dealing with China to the Russia threat to deterrence and defense adaptation, cyber, hybrid, from the Arctic to the Indo-Pacific, and so forth. So that's what I'm doing now. I've been doing this for about 5 years, which seems like a short time, but in a cabinet position is actually quite long, because these jobs are a little intense, so to speak. But before that, I spent roughly 15 years working on security, but more for the human security, protection of civilian side. First actually in Central America, working more on challenges related to paramilitary groups and protection of civilians, and then moving to the Middle East with specific focuses on Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, working again on issues of governance by non-state armed groups and challenges to development and human security. So really, pretty much I've always worked for 20 plus years in the broader field of security and defense, but I would say going from a more non-governmental, ground-based perspective to what is now my job, which is really at the center of what is, I think, a pretty crucial institution when it comes to transatlantic security. It's really interesting. I think for those who are interested in policy making, it's a nice experience to try the different functions, because you do understand policy issues differently, depending on whether you're sitting in academia, in a think tank, or inside a cabinet. It just provides a different perspective, and it's a great learning experience in terms of seeing how to translate ideas into action, and how to, to see how actual decisions are made. Because of course, there's only so much you can see from the outside and from the books. That's just a fact. But of course, being on the outside allows you to have greater freedom, flexibility to explore ideas. So there are plus and minuses on both sides. I find it very interesting throughout my career to have had the privilege of trying policy making through these different channels, because I think it makes probably makes your work a little bit more well-rounded in terms of understanding the different perspective of the stakeholders. That's about me. But if you want, as I was prompted, I can go into overview of how NATO is looking at the security environment. I think that the title aptly summarizes it. And again, as I said, I'm very happy to keep this informal, so please feel free to interrupt me, ask questions either from here, whatever direction, and I will stop my spiel and engage. Otherwise, I think I'm gonna speak for roughly 20 minutes and sort of give you a where is NATO at, and how we are preparing for the next NATO summit. In NATO political cycles, the summits, which is when our heads of state and government meet, in the last few years, it has been on a yearly basis, simply because the number and size of decisions requires them to meet that frequently. It's not a hard rule, but until there is a full-scale war waging in Europe, I will foresee that we will maintain that routine of yearly meetings. So we're now preparing for the next NATO summit, which will take place in Vilnius, in Lithuania in July. And perhaps I can go through how the alliance is changing. I'll try to be as less bureaucratic as possible, because I actually think that looking at how NATO's agenda is transforming is not just about the organization, it's first and foremost about the changes in the broader strategic environment and the changing perceptions of security in the broader transatlantic community. So it's not really about NATO, it's about how NATO allies, so the European states and North Americans, are changing their understanding of security, defense, and strategic priorities. So in that sense, I think it's quite interesting for those who are interested in European and transatlantic security. So I think it's fair to say that NATO as an organization and the broader transatlantic community is really as a watershed moment in its history. On the one hand, there is, of course, continuity when it comes to what the mandate and the main purpose of the organization is. That has been the same for 74 years, plus minus. We're heading to 75th anniversary in April 2024. So the continuity is clear. It's about the mandate. The mandate is to enable the collective defense of the allies. It's to ensure security both of the territory and the population. And it's about security, defense, and freedom of allies. So in that sense, it's not easy, but it is simple in terms of what the purpose of the organization is. And to do that, the alliance utilizes both military and non-military means. It's important, I think, that we always think of NATO not just as a military alliance, but as a political and military alliance. Especially that's always been part of the DNA of the organization since 1949, but it's even more important in an environment of strategic competition. When I would argue that the vast majority of the challenges to our security are non-kinetic, and they are performed through non-military means. So that political function is even more important today, I would say. So the purpose has remained constant, but of course, the how you do it, how do you ensure collective defense? What does it even mean? That has changed quite dramatically over the past 7+ decades, because the security environment has changed dramatically over the past 7 decades. And I think really in a way since 2014, and I'll explain that in a second, but definitely since the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine in February, we are in a different security environment. So we are in a phase of, I would say, profound transformation as an alliance. And in order to give you a glimpse into what I mean, or at least my assessment, my 2 cents of what that means, I want to use the example of the NATO strategic concept, which is this document that is agreed since the end of the Cold War, roughly every 10 years. And basically, it's the NATO it's the one expression of grand strategies, where all the allies come together, agree on how do they see the security environment, what do they see as the threats, the challenges, and the tasks for NATO. And in 2022, almost a year ago, allies agreed a new strategic concept, the 2022 one. This was the 8th time in NATO's history that exercise was carried out. And I will not do a history lesson, but I think if you take those 8 concepts and you put them side by side, you see the changes in the alliance. You had 4 during the Cold War. They were secret. They were about deterring and defending against the Soviet Union. It was very clear. It was about one threat, one theater, conventional and nuclear deterrence. So very, again, not easy to do, but relatively simple, straightforward job. Then the Cold War ended, and we had 3 post-Cold War strategic concepts, 91, 99, 2010. These were the reflection of a fundamentally altered assumptions with respect to the European security environment. The notion was the Euro-Atlantic area is at peace. So basically, we have it pretty good. Europe is a space of predictability, stability. There are shared norms. Of course, we will still need to care about our security and defense, but most of the challenges will be asymmetric in nature, will be connected to terrorism, insurgency, and they will come from out of area. So we need to do better when it comes to responding to crisis, be it in the Balkans during the wars in the 90s or later on in Afghanistan. So it was very much a pivot away from the traditional territorial defense of Europe focus and really embracing a much larger understanding of security. And that drove fundamental changes in our defense spending, our force structure, how we thought about our militaries, how we thought about the role of partnerships and non-military cooperations versus defense. It was a big transformation. I put all on the table because if you read all of these and then you take the 2022 strategic concept and you open it, you see that word, the post-Cold War peace dividend era, at least from our side, is finished. I would say the biggest example, the biggest reason why the set of assumptions, unfortunately, it's not a positive development, it's just a reflection of reality. But the biggest evidence that those assumptions don't hold anymore is, of course, that Europe is at war. There is a full-scale conventional war in Europe, in the heart of Europe, the size of which we haven't seen really for many decades. So the first assumption that underpinned our strategic planning for decades, which was the Euro-Atlantic areas of peace, it's no longer valid. And the 2022 strategic concept recognizes that. It recognizes that because of that fact, we need to prepare for a fundamentally less benign security environment, one in which that notion, that assumption of predictability simply is not going to hold anymore, at least for the time being. Of course, we all wish to see a return to stability and predictability and shared norms in the Euro-Atlantic area, but that's not where we live today. So if there is one message that allies agreed in 2022 is we are no longer in the post-Cold War era, we are in something else. And that something else is characterized by a security environment that is, first of all, way more volatile. So we need to prepare for persistent fragility, whether it is in the Euro-Atlantic area or in our broader periphery. And that's quite important because it requires us to shift from a mindset of crisis as exceptions to crisis as the new norm that we need to be prepared for. And that's quite a big undertaking in terms of resources, but also mindset. Second, we need to prepare for a world in which more and more there will be shocks that are not necessarily connected to defense and security, but they will profoundly affect the way we do defense and security. And we're thinking about climate change, of course, first and foremost, as a constant disruptive factor that will continue to create crisis, that will continue to also generate demands of an armed forces, and will just have to be something that we need to prepare for and adapt to when it comes to understanding our mission. So a world of persistent fragility and recurrent shocks. And then the third main trend that the strategic concept describes, and I think it's the one that probably is most transformative in terms of how we see the security environment, and that is the rise of strategic competition, which means, of course, a lot of different things. But to summarize it, at least from where I see it in NATO, it's about the fact that we have authoritarian, assertive adversaries and competitors that are challenging us on a persistent basis and across the spectrum. That means the kinetic, the military, but as I said before, more and more also the non-military, whether it is energy blackmail, like Russia did since the beginning, actually even before the beginning of its war of aggression against Ukraine, whether it is economic coercion, whether it's about generating strategic dependencies to then use them to limit our freedom of maneuver and our ability to conduct our foreign policy. And here I'm thinking, of course, of the People's Republics of China strategy. But it's also about more disinformation, more hybrid threats, more cyber attacks, and overall a much more complex security environment, which not a very happy description, but I think especially as Europeans, and this I open a personal parenthesis, not as NATO, but I think as many, especially Western Europeans, we really suffered from a few years of looking at the world through the lens of what we wish the world to be rather than what the world as it is. And we have to fix that gap, whether it is about recognizing that Russia has been in a pattern of destabilizing and adversarial behavior, at least since 2014, if not earlier. One could say it's actually since 2007 and Putin's speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he fundamentally said, I do not recognize the post-Cold War order, and I want to reclaim my spheres of influence. And we sort of listened, nodded, and proceeded with business as usual. So in a sense, it's about recognizing the profound transformation of our relationship with Russia, which for NATO is now the primary, most direct and strategic threat to our security and defense. But it's also about recognizing that there are other actors, such as the People's Republic of China, that for us may not be a military adversary, but they're certainly a strategic competitor with deep and real consequences when it comes to Euro-Atlantic security. So it's about that tour d'horizon that allows us to really see a security environment that is much more deteriorated than it has been, unfortunately, for generations. And that's the starting point with which we are going. We did the last summit in Madrid, where the strategic concept was adopted, but that's also the assessment that we bring with us when we go into the next NATO summit in Vilnius. And so with that in mind, it's of course not a surprise that some of the priorities for us have to do, well, first of all, I think one of the lessons of the last year, or plus minus, but again, we can count differently from my perspective as NATO is really since 2014. But the point is, we cannot take defense for granted. And we really need to rebuild our ability to do deterrence and defense, and to think about the territorial defense of Europe in a way that we hadn't actually done since the end of the Cold War. That sounds like a slogan, but it's not. It's really quite a profound transformation in how much you spend for defense, especially European countries. What capabilities you buy, and how do you have the right procurement and acquisition process. We can talk more about that, but we have across the transatlantic community a huge problem when it comes to matching our demand with the industrial production, with defense industrial production. Again, because for decades we weren't producing at the speed and rate that we now need, because of course there is a war and we need to rebuild our ability to do defense credibly. So just to say, it's not just a slogan, it's actually a really big set of it's a heavy, there is some really profound restructuring. It's also about thinking, how do we deploy our armed forces, our deterrence and defense posture. And if it's of interest, I'm happy to explain how the deterrence and defense posture of NATO has been changing since 2014, since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. That's when the planning started. But over the next few years, you will really have a complete restructuring and essentially going back, resetting a new baseline and going back to a much more credible and robust posture. And again, that it's hard to do in terms of financial resources, political capital, mindset shift, bringing the population along, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, of course, one of the big priorities for us at the NATO summit. It's about implementing those decisions so that we can have a much more credible and stronger deterrence and defense posture. It's also about continuing to advance the work we're doing when it comes to preparing for strategic competition. And then, because I don't want to take too much time, I'm happy to go more into the various topics, but one overarching theme, it's about building our collective and individual resilience, whether it's about our critical infrastructure, whether it's about our energy sector, whether it's about mitigating our strategic vulnerabilities in the economic sphere. Again, easier said than done because of course there's financial implications, but again, there is a profound mindset shift from looking at economics and security as two separate categories to having to integrate national security and collective security considerations into economic choices. And I think for me, that's one of the most important lessons learned over the last year, just with respect to Russia's war against Ukraine. We learned what the cost of one-sided dependencies on authoritarian actors can be with the energy crisis. Now we need to make sure we don't replicate those dependencies, for example, when it comes to renewables, and China was pretty much as large share when it comes to the critical supply chain related to renewables. So it's the work on resilience that also features very highly and will continue at the summit. Of course, and this is obvious, I could have said it first, but of course for us, it's restructuring, resetting a new baseline for our deterrence and defense, continuing to invest in resilience, but politically, one of the key priorities, of course, to continue to support Ukraine. I didn't say it first because in my mind, it's let's take it for granted, but absolutely not. That will be at the center of the summit. It's about to continue, first of all, to signal resolve when it comes to our support for Ukraine. It's not going to wax and wane. It's not going to diminish. We know that the Kremlin strategy is to exactly wait us out. So it's important that we send that message. And that's, of course, about political statement, but it's also about practical support. And that's why now NATO is really deepening its support for Ukraine with a multi-year program. So it's not just about supporting Ukraine today so that it can exercise its right to self-defense, but it's just as importantly about looking at the long-term future so that the country, after it prevails as a sovereign and independent country, is able to deter and defend against future aggression. And that's about providing a long-term support for its armed forces. It's also about thinking through the issue of security, what security architecture and what security arrangements will guarantee Ukraine's security in the future. It's more a broader political question than just a NATO question, but it's on the table. Of course, it's in the minds of our leaders as they meet at the NATO summit. How am I doing? I'll wrap it up. But these are some of the key headlines, but I would be remiss if I didn't end by saying, of course, as we do all of this, we are not, and I think it's a really important message, we're not going back to a Cold War world where an alliance like NATO can afford to think through only one threat, one theater, one scenario, and always think through the prism of conventional and nuclear deterrence. That's simply not the world we live in. So just as important for us is to maintain that more global approach. That means, first of all, recognizing links between theaters. And that's one of the reasons why we are really investing in our relationship with our Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, who are going to come, who have been invited to come again at the NATO summit in Vilnius. It will be the second time in 2 years. Again, the message is clear. We understand that the security developments in the Euro-Atlantic area affect the Indo-Pacific and vice versa. And that connection is going to grow even more important as the Indo-Pacific grows in economic and strategic significance, which we know is happening. So it's about recognizing those links. It's about recognizing the links between the military and the non-military. And it's, of course, about continuing to have a, I would say, broad approach to security. In other words, yes, we're rebuilding conventional forces. Yes, we're investing in air defenses. Yes, we're doing everything we need so that we can credibly deter and defend. But we're not forgetting that there's so many other threats like climate change or terrorism that are not bound by geography, and that require us to maintain also a broader set of tools. And I'm happy to go a little bit more, if it's of interest, in the Q&A, telling you how we're dealing with all of these different priorities. So it's a lot, because the security environment demands it, and because you cannot afford to go back to a situation in which you really think only through the prism of one particular theater or threat. But of course, the priority in terms of biggest military adjustment of our posture has to do with rebuilding our ability to do collective defense, and especially the territorial defense of Europe, because de facto we spent 40 years thinking we would never need to do that again. And it's a good thing. Like, I really wish that was true, but the reality is that it's not. Russia's behavior and its war against Ukraine demonstrates that it's not. China's increasing assertiveness in and around Taiwan and Indo-Pacific demonstrate that we can simply not take the broader international security environment. We cannot analyze it only through a lens of cooperation. We also need to understand what contestation, how to deal with contestation and competition. So that's where we are, and I think it's a very interesting time to it's a really interesting time to work at NATO, if I may say so, but also to follow the evolution of the alliance, because I think for the first time in a few decades, questions that are of geopolitical significance are back on the table. I don't know how I did with time, but knowing myself, I probably spoke for too long.
No, I would say you did not speak for too long. Certainly, it was like every point that you touched on, I found myself tempted to listen to another 20-minute discussion just on that. Unfortunately, we're a little bit we don't have as much time as maybe some of these subjects deserve. It's really interesting. I like especially the idea, we hear a lot these days about NATO expansion and the degree to which Russia was provoked to war, which, like, leaving aside the degree to which that absolves Russia of accountability, I think that you raised some really interesting points about the idea that, in fact, threats to NATO have expanded as well, and maybe that's perhaps a topic that's less well discussed. Before I ask any of my questions, I do want to make sure that my fellow panelists, if we can use the term, are included as well. Do you guys have any questions that you want to queue up for Dr. Berti, and also people from the audience? I do encourage you to raise your hands as you want. I'm going to try to filter the questions, but yeah, I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, okay, Alex, you can go ahead, and then it looks like Natalie's ready to unmute the mic too. So we'll let you off the leash afterwards. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I'll go first, only because I didn't hear you mention it, and I was just curious about this area in particular. I was wondering if you could comment on the increasing strategic importance of the Arctic and sort of how this figures into NATO's future planning, sort of as an emerging security threat and concern, especially with regard to increasing strategic competition.
Yeah, let's do a few. Yeah. Well, you tell me, but I'm agreeable. Okay, we'll just agree with each other then. Natalie, why don't you throw one on there also? And if anyone in the audience wants to throw in one question, we can do that. See how much time we have left after this one. Okay, we'll get you next week. and Priya also. Okay, so Natalie, then Priya, and then we'll get to our resident Stomfius.
Oh, thanks so much for being here. It's really interesting, everything you had to say. And I agree with Sean that I would love to explore everything you said a lot more. But I was just wondering if as you described, security is touching so many different realms. And from your perspective, where does it stop? If you could extend it to food security, to transportation, energy, like where should NATO's influence end, I guess?
I was curious if we could go a little bit more into NATO's relationship with its Indo-Pacific partners and strategic priorities there. That was something that was emphasized a lot in the new strategic concept, and I just saw that NATO is opening a liaison office in Tokyo, right? Okay, so I mean, I just think that that's going to be a really important feeder in the future, and particularly, if Ukraine has made us think about what could happen if there's a Chinese move on Taiwan, and how that would pivot US attention away from Europe, and how that might implicate NATO, and what that means for the future of the Transatlantic Alliance. So I would be curious to expand on that. And thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here, first of all. And my question is related to things Natalie referred to. And then specifically, you were saying you're thinking about climate change as well. And what I think is really interesting for climate change is how it will in fact impact food security. And sort of two questions, like how far is NATO in thinking about these things? Are they actually inventarizing like which countries will have what levels of food production, what partners do? And then the same question as Natalie, like how much will NATO get involved in solving problems that arise or hedging these risks?
Yeah. And I just want to interject also that for anyone attending online, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box, and we will try our best not to forget about you.
Can I just add one part to my question? I'm also curious, given the burden sharing difficulties that NATO has had prior to the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, like how does that impact the fact that NATO's scope has now expanded to all these different areas?
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for the questions. They're excellent. Maybe I'll start with the question about where does security end. I think that's a really important one, and one that we have that we think through regularly. It's one of the, because I subscribe to the broader assessment that is, we live, let me get through what it's going through my mind. If we are in a more contested environment where more and more challenges to our security come from non-security realms, then we are a little bit in a catch-22. On the one hand, we're securitizing every discussion, and we know from the past that that's not always helpful. Not securitizing an issue may bring greater attention to it, but may also lead to suboptimal policy responses if you then look at it only through the lens of the military or security toolkit. I think my personal view, of course, not institutional. I would say, for example, the discussion on stabilization and terrorism in the past has been securitized to a point that for a while we really thought of only the security part of countering terrorism, and we left behind the discussion about how, in order to have sustainable stability, you also need reconstruction, development, human security, a lot of other issues that are very important, and they have nothing to do with the military as a tool or with our security discussion. So on the one hand, I think it's very important that we don't fall into that fallacy. And I think the work we do on climate is a good example of how we're trying to do that. For example, on climate security, the assessment, I think it's quite clear. On climate change, the assessment is clear. It is a defining challenge of our time. It will affect everything. And when I say it will affect everything, of course, it will also affect our security directly in our own countries, because more extreme weather events, more natural disasters, more of those instances that will require ultimately also the response of our armed forces, because we know that when things get very, very complex and difficult, most of our civilian structures simply don't have the capacity alone to deal with those challenges. So we need to factor in how to also have the military play a role. So that's, for example, a very specific angle where it is for NATO to think about. It is about climate change, but it is still within very much our mandate, which is how it affects defense and security, and how do we prepare armed forces. So that's one element. The other element of the work on climate is understanding how it affects and exacerbates other conflicts, whether it's in areas that are already fragile, whether it is in communities that are where there are already grievances that can be exacerbated by the effects of climate change. Again, a lot of the solutions to these problems will not be delivered through the military or through security policies, but there is a security angle, and there is a military and there is a defense angle, which is how do we prepare our missions and operations so they're cognizant of the effect of climate change, so they're built in a way that do not exacerbate the impact of climate change, so they're built in a way that promotes sustainability. So again, there is a NATO angle, and that's the one we have. But overall, our approach to climate is how do we better understand what it does to our security, be it at home, be it in our neighborhood, or be in the context of strategic competition. So better intelligence, better assessment, better exercise, and better training. How do we adapt our armed forces to operate in a climate that will be wetter, hotter, windier, just more complicated? So that's very nitty-gritty, if you wish. It's from the equipment to, having the helicopters that can fly, the equipment that is able to make sure that your forces that are deployed in a 50-degree Celsius Iraqi summer are able to fulfill their mandate, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also, and so that's also a big area of work, the adaptation. How do we adapt our militaries? And how do we adapt it also in a way that is consistent with the broader energy transition that our countries are all undergoing? So if we all transition away from fossil fuels, certainly we cannot afford our militaries to be left behind. They need to be part of the transition too, while retaining operational effectiveness. Tricky one, but one where NATO is actively working. So again, our angle is how do we work with industry? How do we work to promote green technologies for the industry, for our militaries? How do we promote better energy sustainability in our military? So again, it's bringing it back to what we do, but looking at it through the broader lens of climate change. And finally, and then I'll move from climate, it's just something that I think it's interesting, the work we're doing. So that's why I emphasize it. And then the third part of our work is how do we mitigate? Because of course, if this affects everyone and it's a whole encompasses challenge, then of course, every sector of society needs to play its part. So that includes the militaries. So then we're looking at how do we collectively map all our emissions so that at least we know what we're doing. How do we actually mitigate our own carbon footprint? For NATO, we have our own goal of going to net zero, and we're going between now and 2040. Don't quote me on the year because I'm blinking out, but we're going on a 4 to 5% reduction in our emission year by year for NATO installations. So we are doing all of this. One could say, well, this is not your mission. It's not about security, but it's not about collective defense, but I would argue, yes, it is. But at the same time, we're not securitizing the issue because we're not pretending to be the first responder or the only responder. We're looking at how it affects our mission, which is defense and security. And I would say and that was an illustration of the difficult thinking process we're going through to answer your very important question. Where does it stop? So climate and security is one area. Economic security is another. Again, NATO will not necessarily have all the tools or necessarily be the first in charge, but we believe that in a context in which adversaries and strategic competitors use economic tools to undermine our security, we can't simply ignore it. Then the point is to use NATO as the political platform, the only one you have, where you have Europe and North America come together to share intelligence, to share best practices, to agree principles on what does it mean to mitigate strategic vulnerabilities that can affect our core business. So to have those discussions, to exchange those, to have that political level discussion, a lot of the implementation will then be either for countries who are also EU members, it will be through the EU. For others who are not EU members, which for NATO is it's a significant amount of population and territory, Canada, United States, Norway, United Kingdom, Turkey, etc. Those will be done domestically or in a coordination. So the issue is how do you find your added value and how do you bring the issues that have a direct impact on security and defense to NATO, while recognizing that we can't necessarily be the ones, for example, legislated, and that's not within our mandate. So that's a little bit the trade, the balance. It's a difficult one because, again, the word is more complicated than it has been for a while. We used to be very clear what is military, what isn't military. And that was a comfortable distinction for all of us, but it's no longer so clear cut. Think about transportation, like transport infrastructure. It's owned by civilian actors, either private sector or government. And you could say, well, it has nothing to do with security and defense. But guess what? If you need to move your troops across Europe, the bridges need to be built in a way that they can carry tanks. The road need to be broad enough. The 5G you use needs to be secure so that it cannot be jammed or hacked or shut down. Your civilian satellite that you need to communicate need to also be safe so you're not intercepted. So you could say it's nothing to do with defense and security, but the reality is, unless there is a minimum common security standard embedded in that critical infrastructure, you're not going to be able to use it. So that's a little bit the catch-22. I think we're moving forward in the right direction. We have I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty, but we have a lot of work on this, and we have more and more EU cooperation with the EU. Just last week, we started the NATO EU task force on critical infrastructure, where we're really looking at what are the key vulnerabilities in our critical infrastructure. How do we properly assess, map, and think about and mitigate, actively mitigate, because we know that otherwise you can have fully operational and trained armed forces, but if you can't move them around, that's going to be a problem. And I'm making just an easy example, which is physical infrastructure, but the digital is just as important. So that's a little bit the trade-off. On food security, I think we are in the awareness and information sharing in that business. Meaning food security is hugely important to many of our, well, to all of us, but also to our member states. It's hugely important in how we relate to many countries around the world, that infamous global South expression that do not necessarily side with us 100% when it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine. It is a hugely important issue. So from a NATO perspective, it's more about having that awareness and sharing those information, both in terms of how food security affects the broader stability of the Euro-Atlantic area and our broader neighborhood, but also understanding how Russia is using it. And that's very important because we have seen, I open a parenthesis, but I think it's important. We have really seen the Russia's way of war that, of course, didn't in Ukraine, but of course you could have seen similar strategy in Syria before, in Chechnya. Pick your case study, but it's really systematically about downgrading and destroying the civilian infrastructure to try to crush any possibility for resistance. So attacks on the food production infrastructure are really part and parcel of how Russia has been fighting in Ukraine. And it's not by default, it's by design to completely cripple Ukraine's ability to produce food for itself and for exports, which of course is key to its economic viability, right, as a state. So so we do a lot of also thinking, analysis, and information sharing around that, because it's really important. And of course, we need to think it through also with the context of reconstruction, because just as important as enabling Ukraine to defend itself, exercise its right to self-defense today, we need to think about how do we support it to remain a viable, independent country. And that requires also thinking right now about reconstructions and rebuilding of the country. And of course, the food security will be key to that, whether it's about wheat production or boosting production of fertilizers, et cetera, et cetera. So sorry, I actually spoke a lot about that, but it's a question that it's really important, and we have it in our mind every single time we open a new file. Is this really something we should be doing? Because going to part 2 of your question, our resources are limited, so we can't be doing everything. If you try to do everything that you do, then you end up spread too thin. So it's very clear. But that's why I think we are, well, first of all, we are increasing the resources for NATO. That's very important. We hadn't, after the end of the Cold War, we basically stagnated for 30, 40 decades, 3 to 4 decades. Now we are back to recognizing that we cannot do more with less. We need to have more resources so that we can cope with the security environment. But then it's also about retaining some hard security measures, and that's where 2% comes in. We need to be able to do resilience. We need to be able to build partnerships. We need to do all that. But cannot be at the expenses of defense spending, cannot be at the expenses of rebuilding our armed forces and having the right capabilities to deter and defend. It's not a zero-sum game. We need to be able to do both. But I think especially for allies that had underspent in defense for decades and they're picked up the pace since 2014, the message is clear. This is not optional, and you cannot substitute with anything else. There needs to be a rebuilding of our ability to do deterrence and defense, and that requires spending more in defense, because it's just as simple as that. So it's clear that there are some, I think, homework that needs to be done no matter what. Arctic, yes, sorry. Now for something completely different. But not so different, because the Arctic is another. So the more than the Arctic, I'll go a little bit one step more in depth. I'll zoom into the European high north, which is the part of the Arctic that is directly, of course, relevant to the defense of Europe. And I think the assessment is this area matters more than it has, again, for years. Be it because of the pretty intense military modernization of Russians' capabilities in the Arctic, being because we see China's increased interest in Arctic research and exploration, and ultimately defining itself as a near Arctic state. So we see it as being a growing arena for strategic competition, that's for sure. We also see that because of climate change, those trends are most likely going to be exacerbated. So that places more strategic importance on the Arctic and the European high north specifically as a region. But then there is an additional reason why NATO is caring and will continue to care more about the European high north. And that's, of course, the alliance is changing. Just a few weeks ago, Finland became the 31st ally of NATO, and Sweden will also become a NATO ally. So once those two accession processes are completed, you see an alliance of 32, and you see the entire European North is NATO territory. What it means when I mean NATO territory, I mean that it becomes part of our mandate to be able to defend it. So if you need to defend it, you need to have the right forces, you need to have the right plans, you need to have the right understanding of what the challenges are. So yes, the high north is going to become more important for NATO defense planners. It's very important also in terms of how you defend the Baltic Sea. The way you defend the Baltic Sea after Finland and Sweden are NATO allies is different from before in pretty significant way. That's a very big and very positive development when it comes to the credibility of our ability to defend every inch of allied territory, which is very much what we want, what we will do. So in that sense, all of these are reasons why the Arctic is why the European high north is more important to NATO. Also in terms of policy, I think it's quite interesting that at the moment after Finland and Sweden after the ratification process is complete, the only non-NATO country on the Arctic Council will be Russia, which of course is already creating its own policy challenges. That's not for NATO, but it's just an additional observation of how some of the mechanism through which we had governed the high north in the past may prove more difficult, in this world where cooperation is lower, trust is lower, and the whole model was high north, low tensions, which is really good. And if they manage, fantastic. But we might credibly need to prepare for a situation in which that paradigm doesn't hold anymore. So yes, I think it matters more. Should I talk about Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, please.
I just get annoyed at hearing my own voice for too long, so I apologize. That's just, hopefully it's just me. But these are all excellent questions, and I get excited and I talk too much. But the Indo-Pacific, this is first. It might seem small, but it's a huge change in the again, a huge strategic shift in NATO. The 2022 strategic concept was not just the first NATO strategy ever to mention China, but was also the first NATO strategy to mention the Indo-Pacific and to say, which again, it may seem obvious, but remember, this is a negotiated document with 30 allies that becomes official policy. So even if it seems obvious, the fact that it's agreed, it's politically quite significant. And this is the first concept that says that security developments in the Indo-Pacific affect the Euro-Atlantic area. And that's a clear link that we are now developing in terms of how do we better understand the links between the two theaters? How do we better work with partners that we have in that region to collaborate on what are shared security challenges? And you mentioned Japan. With Japan, the level of cooperation has increased really significantly in very few years. I arrived in NATO in 2017, and there's a sea change in how much we're doing, in how important the political engagement is and the practical cooperation. And it's really quite broad. Politically, it's about discussing what are the regional security challenges, how the war in Ukraine is affecting global security, and of course, our Indo-Pacific partners, even though they are geographically very far, they're all supporting Ukraine through assistance. They're all supporting sanctions, so they're all also part of the message that to us is so important, that what's happening in Ukraine, it's not about Europe. It's really about what type of broader security environment, what type of world do we want to live in. And the fact that New Zealand, which is really far, I was there like 3 weeks ago. It took me like 30 hours to get there. And the fact that nobody there had any doubt or question whatsoever as to why there is no alternative but supporting Ukraine so that it prevails as a sovereign independent country was so heartening to me in terms of understanding that really this is not just a European or a transatlantic security crisis. So we are working with them on strategic discussions. We are working with them more on practical cooperation. Again, each country has different priorities, so we don't cooperate on the same topics with each of our Indo-Pacific partners. But for example, topics that are of interest in general, from climate change to countering hybrid threats, cybersecurity, human security, disaster preparedness and response. So there's quite a bit that we can and are doing together. And I think that's the reports that you saw in the press about the liaison office is something quite, again, it's small, but politically it's an interesting signal. It's something that even 5 years ago would have been very far away from the mental mindset of both NATO and Japan. And today is quite a no-brainer that we need to be talking more, cooperating more. It doesn't mean necessarily that this is about a military deployment in the Indo-Pacific or vice versa, but it's about recognizing that our theaters are interconnected in profound ways, not the least because both theaters are underpinned by the United States deterrent effects and capabilities. So of course that's just a basic fact, but beyond that we also have shared interests, and I think there's more strategic convergence than there has been for many years.
I'm glad you brought up kind of cyber in the Indo-Pacific. I think much has been made of the role that China plays vis-a-vis their support of Russia, and like the recent call between President Zelensky and Xi Jinping. I think there's a view that China is sort of inimical to a lot of NATO's goals. But I think from as an American, I am also reading this domestic news about American efforts to dissever itself from Chinese tech industry, from semiconductor manufacturing, trying to prevent exports of US really high-grade intellectual property that produces, designs, or owns the rights to semiconductors and basically processing chips that are necessary for developing an artificial intelligence. And to some extent, I see this as a smart move, or the United States is trying to insulate itself from a potential loss of Taiwanese boundaries from a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. But on the other hand, it seems a little bit provocative. So I guess what I'm kind of wondering about is like, when a key ally of NATO is sort of either trying to court European industries to move to the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, or sort of prodding China. I don't know if it's really prodding. I mean, I sort of hesitate to blame NATO members for potential aggression from non-NATO members, but I'm going to anyway for the sake of this question. What do you think about NATO having a key ally like the United States that is sort of self-serving and might actually be creating more of a security threat by sort of provocative policies with regards to China? I hope that question made sense, because I don't think it needed to be that long.
Yeah, I definitely did. It's a different,
Okay.
let me, again, I can. It's not a secret that when it comes to how to deal with the systemic challenge posed by China, there are different assessments. No, there are different policies and different policy discussions in different parts of NATO. Whether it's about economic decoupling or de-risking, like the European Commission, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, recently referred to. So there are different policy frameworks that are being developed. And I think it's very easy and to focus on the fact that those policy frameworks are inevitably at differences, and there are transatlantic differences that could be tensions on the issue. But let me flip it for 1 second and say, yes, but the underlying assumption of all these policy discussions is similar. It is that we have a problem. Nobody's saying these dependencies are something that are sustainable, that are risk-free, and that are in line with our democratic principles and needs for security. So we all see that there is an issue there, and we are trying to solve it while recognizing that there are economic relations, while recognizing a number of other factors. But given that in the public discourse there's so much about the differences, I feel maybe it might make sense for me to actually focus on where the convergence is. And I can say this a little bit from the NATO side, where we started discussing the China in 2019. So it's very recent. And now it's 2023. So within very little time, the amount of transatlantic convergence that I have observed on this issue, I think it's nothing short of impressive. We started with quite disparate assessments of what we saw. And I think now there's a growing convergence of recognizing, yes, this is a systemic challenge. Yes, there are impacts on Euro-Atlantic security. There is a democratic resilience angle. There is a security angle. There is an economic angle. All these angles are true simultaneously, and that will create very complex policy choices. But overall around the table, and you see this in the strategic concept, everyone is on the same page that China's coercive policies and stated objectives are a challenge to Euro-Atlantic security and to our interests, to our security, to our values. So we have to deal with it. I think that finding transatlantic convergence is not just essential for successfully dealing with the China challenge, which is really too big for just Europe or even just North America to deal with alone. But I also think it's a key test for the transatlantic community. This is such an important issue that we need to find a way to work together on it, and cannot compartmentalize. I think that's why there's so much work in the NATO context on bridging that gap by sharing more intelligence, doing more shared assessments, having that shared situational awareness that it's really step one. You need to understand, you need to have a shared understanding of what you're seeing in order to have common policy responses. And at least on that, I see so much more convergence. Now we're working more on resilience. Again, how to protect, how to build a resilience. Again, more convergence, but yes, are there different ways to go about it? And will they, over the next year, more likely than not, generate frictions around the transatlantic community? I think that's fair to say, but I also would argue that it's not uncommon for us in NATO to deal with the fact that allies do have bilateral, sometimes multilateral disagreements, including on very important issues. But it's important to also highlight that there's much more convergence sometimes that it's given credit to.
Let's see what Evan has to ask. We can take a few more questions because, yeah, there's not so much time left and I'm tempted to hog all of it. So yeah, go ahead, Evan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your insights. It's been very interesting. Mentioning perfect segue, bilateral and multilateral differences within the alliance. There are several ways to think about it, but one that comes to mind is Turkey, especially with the elections coming up. Could you give some insights into what NATO has been thinking about Turkey's role in the alliance with their actions, especially in their stances and policies towards Russia, and then also the election aspect, what you're predicting and what you think the different scenarios would be based on whichever outcome. Thank you.
I think, did you have a question also, Louis? Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. Question would be on the institutional culture at NATO since the war started. So a lot of the initiatives you mentioned, like the communication and the road infrastructure, are issues that were raised by the US with the European Defense Initiative since 2014, and yet NATO is only beginning to address them in the political sphere. So I wonder, how does ally nation mentality impacted what was possible before, and how do you ensure the mobilization will remain for the future? Thank you.
Okay, I guess maybe that's something we can dig into for the next handful of minutes or however long it takes. I mean, I'm not going to constrain your answers. And then we have another 30 minutes. So yeah.
Well, let me spend 30 minutes about talking about NATO EU. No, just kidding. No, maybe I'll take them in reverse order. I take it in two parts. First, I think you're absolutely right that Russia's war against Ukraine in February 22 has made some discussions in NATO move a lot faster. And that's the discussion about not so much the discussion about defense spending, because that one had been quite high on the political agenda since 2014. But I think the speed with which we have been able to implement those decisions on deterrence and defense, I think is definitely, I think the time cycle has been accelerated by the war. Those decisions were going to be made anyways. But I think the fact that we were able to activate our defense plans within hours, double the number of battle groups on the eastern flank, again, within days, all this is a direct response to the fact that there was a clear realization by all allies that the security environment really demands us to move quickly, and some reticence that may have been there, including on how to describe Russia and how to relate to Russia. That debate, Russia made it easy for us, because even though there was a lot of interest, and there still is, in finding a workable relation, and many allies up until very close to the beginning of the war were saying, what can we do to de-escalate, what can we do to cooperate? Well, after Russia starts this war of aggression, that discussion becomes very easy, because we all see the same thing. So yes, I think for sure that has generated a momentum and also a convergence. I think that on these issues it will remain, because unfortunately the reality on the ground is not changing. And I also, this is both an assessment and a wish, because I think it's incredibly important that we do remain united when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And I think any crack will be used by the Russians. So I don't think I really think it's very important, but I'm quite optimistic. Then there is the more softer side of security, the resilience. So that agenda had taken off in NATO also after 2014. So it's not complete. We didn't start it this year. It started for resilience. Really 2015, 2016 is where new baselines were agreed. So there was work in place, but again, it has been accelerated by reality. And it is accelerated in cooperation with others. That's why I kept mentioning the EU, for example, in the issue of resilience. It's clear there's a clear mutually beneficial cooperation there. And of course, the Commission has many of the regulatory tools when it comes to EU member states. Of course, we also have a large part of our territory that it's not EU member states. So we need to always think about how to think about the broader area of responsibility. I think so far that the reality is that some of the potential tensions between who does what, I'm talking about the NATO EU, that I see that sidelined for the time being, because I think there is a realization of just the great challenges we have ahead, and it's really not particularly wise to go into competition mode when we are just two legs of the same system. So I think that I'm not saying that there aren't, but I think a lot of those discussions have to some extent been ameliorated by the fact that the size of work ahead is so massive that as long as we coordinate, we cooperate, we don't duplicate, as long as we do it in the right way, it's clear that there's a lot of work for both of us, and it's not a zero-sum game. So I hope that remains. If it doesn't, I think we're both organizations and both the member states, both organizations will lose out. So it's really not in our interest. And so that was the easiest one, because then the second question was, how do I see Turkey's role in NATO? So first of all, some facts. When you look, I see Turkey's role in NATO as the role it always played, which is an indispensable NATO ally. And if you look at, for a series of reasons, one is geography. Take a map and think about the defense of Europe, and then take away Turkey. Not a good idea. So I think it's so first of all, the geography, the geostrategic position, it's quite important today. I would say it's crucial to the defense of Europe, as it has always been. Its military capabilities, conventional, and when it comes to its armed forces. So Turkey has been and remains an important NATO ally. That does not mean that they're not that there are not at times complexities, right? And of course, you are referring, I imagine, to Finland and Sweden's annexation. That's funny. I'm tired. I do a lot, but to Finland and Sweden joining. Request to join NATO, followed by the invitation by all allies to become members of NATO in Madrid at the last summit in 2022. So it's, I think the important point, there's a few points to make. One is that at the beginning of the process, every enlargement, every time that a new country wants to join NATO, those decisions are and will always be taken by consensus. And they need to be taken on the basis of Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says every European democracy that is in a position to further our security and has the means to do so, and also respects NATO's value, is able to apply for membership. But then, of course, whether that membership is granted or not is a matter of consensus. National security interests will always play a role. So Turkey had a number of national security concerns when it came to both Sweden and Finland, but those have been addressed. When it comes to the process of membership for Finland, as you know, that process is completed. Turkey and the other 29 allies have ratified the protocol. So Finland is now a full NATO ally. That was the quickest accession process in NATO's history. Sweden is not far behind. It's also been invited by all allies, including Turkey, to apply for membership last July. Those accession talks have been completed. They have been ratified by allies, and now we're in the final stage. I am confident that Sweden will become a NATO ally soon. And I think that there are some bilateral issues that have been and continue to be worked through bilaterally between the countries involved. NATO, through the Secretary General, have also been facilitating some of these discussions. It's no secret that from the Secretary General's perspective, he has been on the record saying that he respected and understood Turkey as a security concern, that he facilitated some of these negotiations, and that from his perspective now, both countries, both Sweden and Finland, have complied with what they've agreed in the memorandum. So it's time now to move towards ratification. That is his message. I believe that that's going to happen. And then on the elections, I have learned the hard way never to make predictions about elections. I think many other political analysts should do the same. And there's a few elections where I can quote as prominent examples of people getting them so wrong that I try to stay away from actually speculating on electoral victories and subsequent changes.
As an American, I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about. I do want to run by my fellow panelists again before I keep talking. Do you guys have any other questions that are burning to get out in these last 20 minutes? Or should I go ahead? Go, please, Natalie, please.
In your opinion, what has been the biggest lesson that NATO has learned so far from the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
And I guess what I would ask, since we're just kind of piling on questions, I forgot how the thing I'm supposed to be running worked for a second there. I guess what I would ask also is kind of about Russian disinformation, the degree to which it's effective because it's insidiously designed and deployed, as opposed to the degree to which it just works because, you know, in my country, there's a lot of contrarian conservative, maybe it transcends conservative, I'll just say contrarian people who basically support Russia. They either have conspiracy theories about what it's like in Ukraine, or they think that it's NATO's fault for expanding, and it's this kind of like anti-globalist sort of idea. So I guess my question is sort of what do you make of that? Do you give Russia credit, or is that something that democracies only have ourselves to blame for? Yeah, I guess what kind of policy does NATO have to combat that kind of problem?
I have a question / comment kind of. I was thinking about what you said about how you know, as the security environment has expanded, where we're re-securitizing issues that don't necessarily always benefit from a solely military perspective, and what popped into my mind immediately was gender, and NATO's work on the women, peace and security agenda, and how there's maybe not a tension, but like kind of a push and pull between those who say that, you know, the securitization of gender, it does a disservice to a more holistic and comprehensive, you know, way to address what are, you know, really many different ways that gender issues can present themselves in security challenges. So I was curious, maybe just if you could talk a little bit more about where NATO is in this. You know, it's not necessarily new, but it's something that NATO's really kind of taken a lead on in terms of human security and WPS and what that looks like and where it could go.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. All right. Maybe in reverse order. So yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, Priya, you could talk about this because it's one of the areas you follow closely. But let me see if I remember everything we do in this field. I think first of all, the assessment is right when it comes to setting a policy framework for integration of gender perspectives to defense and security and into armed forces. NATO has played a trailblazing role in the sense that it has one of the most robust policies out there, and it has been, besides being important for shaping our own standards and the way we operate, that policy has been used by a great number of our partner countries and also non-partner countries when they started thinking about the integration of gender perspectives into their own defense and security policy. So that's a clear, important role that NATO continues to play when it comes to setting a standard, and then other like-minded countries follow on the issue. And the women, peace and security agenda is quite all-encompassing, as you know, because it is about gender equality as a transversal principle for everything NATO does. It's about incorporating gender perspectives into our planning from missions and operations, but now more and more into also we do defense planning at large and deterrence and defense. So traditionally, we really had kind of pigeonholed a little bit these topics to crisis management and what we do abroad. But with the new strategic concept, we actually, for the first time, adopted the overarching principle that this need to be transversal consideration, cross-cutting, that we integrate into all our core tasks. So that has a practical implications, which means we're also looking at it in much more traditional security elements, like defense planning process or defense planning cycle. So on the one hand, it is a cross-cutting considerations that we've built into all our policies. It's also something that we integrate into what we're doing training, our capacity building, both for our own forces, but also for partner countries. And I think that's something that has both an operational effectiveness role. Sometimes it's always described as an agenda that it's embraced to be in line with our values. That's certainly true, but we don't integrate gender perspective only because it's the right thing to do. We also know that it's the smart thing to do in terms of leading to better operational outcomes in our armed forces, in our missions, in our operations. So I think that's important that we always bring it back to. It also makes us better at what we do. It's not just the right thing to do. So we do have a pretty all-encompassing women, peace, and security agenda from again the more recognizing the inordinate impact that conflict has on women, to looking at more sustainable and significant integration of gender perspectives into all our policies, to, of course, the issue of increasing our own gender equality within the organization, which is a real priority for the Secretary General. And we have done pretty miraculous work in only 5 years, showing that when there is top leadership and determination, you can really make big strides in increasing your gender balance when it comes to leadership position. And of course, the result is we also have better decision making and a highly competent leadership. So that's good, obviously. On the human security angle, I would say similarly, NATO developed looks at human security through the lens of different agendas: gender and armed conflict, protection of civilians, protection of environmental protection and archaeological heritage, and human trafficking. And for all of these, as a very robust policy that we use both to integrate into our own work, but also to help others, to help partner countries and other in setting standards. So I think it's a quite positive story of how you can integrate these policies into defense and ultimately be more operationally effective. So I'll leave it at that just for time. Disinformation. What do I think about? Is it just a result of foreign interference, be by Russia or other actors, or are we to blame? I don't think it's either or. I think there are obviously grievances in our own societies that can be exploited and can be mobilized and can be utilized and catalyzed to spread disinformation. So I don't think it's either all foreign interference or it's all endogenous. I think it's clearly a combination of both. When it comes to Russia, we know that there's their modus operandi very aggressively. Of course, since before 2022, we've seen electoral interference campaigns, we've seen misinformation and disinformation targeted in many of our allied countries. So we do know that's their pattern, their modus operandi. We are getting, I think, with years, and not just we NATO, but we member states, we European Union, getting better at coordinating, sharing the information, having the visibility and the understanding of what that disinformation landscape looks like. So having a better red picture as to say what our adversaries doing, how, and what are they using, what are the methods, what are the channels. So on that, I think there's been a tremendous progress. We also do much better in terms of coordinating communication so that we can reveal false narratives, set the record straight. So we're doing all of these things. A lot of the work on this, I think it's not for NATO, to be honest. I think a lot of the work is going to be on a national basis, engaging with civil society, promoting free media and journalism, engaging in having better digital literacy. There's so much that can be done with our societies. I mean, I always quote the example of Finland, a country that really has a very strong whole of society concept of defense and security, and that encompasses also building that democratic resilience and societal resilience to disinformation. So there's of course a role for NATO, but it's really a much broader conversation. I don't think that's something that is going to fade or wax and wane or go away necessarily. I think we're going to have to deal with this very complex information environment for the foreseeable future. And that's certainly something that we should consider as a potential vulnerabilities of our democracies. At the same time, it is essential that we protect that freedom of speech and that allows us ultimately to be who we are. So it's a very difficult trade-off. NATO can inevitably only, I think, be one piece of that puzzle, the broader one. On Ukraine, I mentioned a few that are quite obvious, but maybe worth reflecting upon: the importance of retaining transatlantic unity, the importance of taking our defense and security much more seriously, the dangers of relying on authoritarian competitors for our critical services and infrastructure. So I mentioned all of those, but I think one other, and we talked about, I mentioned resilience a minute ago, maybe one of the greatest lessons that I take personally with my interaction with the Ukrainian counterparts, and it's really the importance of that whole of society resilience. I mean, we have seen their unity, we've seen their bravery, we're seeing how the civil society has come together to defend their homeland, to defend their country. And I think it's for us should be a hugely humbling lesson to look at how they are fighting this war, where they don't have the numbers, where everything seemed to be against us. And to be honest, many of us also thought they would fold within weeks, and they have shown us how, you know, determination and commitment and bravery is what they accomplish is nothing short of miraculous. And I think we should learn. There's a lot we can definitely learn from their way of approaching this war and fighting for their country. Ultimately, freedom is not free. It's a cliche, but I think we kind of forgot it for a long time. We might have to relearn it. I don't know, that maybe I'll think about it and come up with something more profound. But I think if we internalize this lesson, we would be better off, the way I see the European security environment evolving.
Okay, I guess in the closing minutes, I just kind of have one sort of final question. It's a little bit more personal and less policy oriented. I think a lot of us that go to this school have professional ambitions to work in NATO, and obviously some of us already have. But I guess, what advice would you give to a young budding diplomat or security strategist why are you laughing? To pursue a career, and maybe some words of encouragement for those of us who are fighting for internships and that. So yeah, just some closing thoughts on that would be great. Thank you.
Closing thoughts, words of encouragement first. That do persevere. That would be my my small words of advice based on my own experience. I mean, this is a very congested field, and you just have to make rejections your own friend and just keep on going until eventually will work out. At least that's what worked for me. And so that's a very small one, but also I would say don't self-deter. I think especially that's something that I see a lot. People are self-deterring into applying for jobs because they think they're not qualified enough. I would say have the hiring manager make that determination and still try, because you're never exactly sure of what profile is being sought. I know these are kind of obvious, but I think for the time being, that's what comes to mind. And yes, persevere and don't self-deter. It sounds like a battle plan, but that's how I approach most things in life. So
maybe it is a battle plan. I think the obvious things bear repeating sometimes, though. So thank you for sharing your insights. I guess I just want to say thanks again for your time. I think these have been really rich topics, and obviously you have so much to say, really kind of off the cuff. So Thanks for stopping by our school and talking with us and giving us the opportunity to talk with you a little bit also. So thanks a lot.